Hello, everyone. This week we are looking at a period in American history that historians have termed the Market Revolution. This is sort of the early part of the 19th century, the period following the War of 1812, which we talked about last week. And it's a period where the country is really booming economically. There is, in the North, as we're going to see, a lot of growth in manufacturing. In the South, the agricultural economy of the South is booming mainly because of the spread and the predominance of cotton as a crop. Cotton is, of course, the raw material that's fueling a lot of the industrialization in the North. Also, the first industrial revolution in Britain as well, and of course, all of this is resulting in an expansion of slavery in the South. So that's really what we're going to be looking at today. This period following the War of 1812, known as the Market Revolution. So, if you'll remember what I talked about last week, when I talked about how President Madison, after the War of 1812, really wanted to, at least initially, he wanted to put forward internal improvements, basically building up the nation's infrastructure because the nation sorely needed better roads, better transportation systems, and this was something that was being pushed by young members of Congress as well. John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, they really argued that the country needed to modernize. And that had been brought home by the War of 1812, which was very difficult to fight because it was difficult to move troops around. It was difficult to get goods from one place to another. And so this was a real problem. Madison got cold feet and kind of vetoed the internal improvements program. So the federal government wasn't really yet ready to undertake or drive the kind of economic integration that would make the market revolution possible. But technological developments were accelerating the pace of economic integration nonetheless. Now, that doesn't mean that the federal government didn't do anything when it came to internal improvements. In 1806, Congress had authorized construction of a paved national road traveling from Cumberland, Maryland to what was then called the Old Northwest. By 1838, that road extended all the way to Illinois. This opened up a lot of new land for settlement. It lowered transportation costs. It made it easier to sell products. It linked the farmers in the surrounding areas to both national and international markets, and it made Americans major consumers of manufactured goods. But it was really water transportation that would be revolutionized with the introduction of the steamboat. Robert Fulton, a artist and engineer from Pennsylvania, was the first to develop the steamboat. And in 1807, Fulton's ship, the Clermont, which you can see a drawing of here, navigated the Hudson River from New York to Albany. This was important because it made possible upstream commerce on major rivers and across the Great Lakes, and eventually, of course, across the ocean. By 1911, the first steamboat was introduced on the Mississippi River, and by 1831, 200 of these steamboats were going up and down the river, and being able to transport goods both upriver and downriver was a major technological advancement. The period following immediately the War of 1812 was this era of intense nationalism, both politically and culturally. But for national unity to have a tangible meaning required the country to become much more integrated economically. And one of the most important achievements of national economic integration came about not through the efforts of the national government or from private enterprise, but by the initiative of a single state. After Madison vetoed the internal improvements bill, the New York State legislature put together a funding package for a canal that would run from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo on Lake Erie. The completion in 1825 of the 363-mile long Erie Canal across upstate New York allowed goods to flow between the Great Lakes and New York City. And this meant that a whole new it opened up a whole new region to be settled widely. Farmers from New England came there in droves. They created new cities like Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse. The governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, he oversaw the construction of the canal, and he predicted that New York would become, he called it the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufactures, the focus of great moneyed operations. He called it a work more stupendous, more magnificent, and more beneficial than has hitherto been achieved by the human race. So it's a little bit of ridiculous hyperbole here, but most Americans probably would have agreed that it was a real triumph of human skill over nature. The Erie Canal made New York City the first among ports in access to trade with the old Northwest. And it really made the city, it made the city into the most powerful city in the country. It sort of grew New York's power in commercial markets, and it fostered its development as a financial center. This was typical. The way that the Erie Canal was built through state government financing was very typical of transportation infrastructure at the time. Within a few years, the canal was carrying about $15 million worth of goods annually. And other states tried to match this kind of success and created their own canals and their own transportation systems. By 1837, more than 3,000 miles of canals had been built, linking the states along the Atlantic Ocean with Ohio, with the Ohio Valley, with the Mississippi valleys, and it drastically reduced the costs of transportation. We also see very early on development of railroads, which opened up vast new areas of the interior to settlement. It stimulated coal mining for fuel, and also iron manufacturing to make locomotives and to make the rails for the railroad. The work on the nation's first commercial railroad began in 1828. This was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And by 1860, the railroad network linking the country had grown to about 30,000 miles of track. We also see a communications revolution happening at this time as well. The telegraph made possible nearly instantaneous communication throughout the country. It was, of course, invented in the 1830s by Samuel B. Morse, who was an artist and an amateur scientist living in New York City. And it was first put into commercial operation in 1844. Within 16 years, 50,000 miles of telegraph wire had been strung throughout the country. Initially, this was a great service for business, especially for newspapers. Newspapers really relied upon the telegraph, and it really helped to speed up the flow of information and bring uniformity throughout the country. So we've got technological advances in both transportation and communication that are really responsible for the creation of this market revolution that develops. Life along the Erie Canal was written about by a man named Basil Hall, who was a British visitor who traveled along the Erie Canal and took very careful notes on what he found there. And in this excerpt, which you read for today, he described life in Rochester, New York. Rochester and other small towns in upstate New York grew very rapidly as a result of the Erie Canal. And you can see how he's describing that growth here. He says, Rochester is celebrated all over the Union as presenting one of the most striking instances of rapid increase in size and population, of which that country affords any example. The word improvement, which in England means making things better, signifies in that country an augmentation in the number of houses and people, and above all, in the amount of the acres of cleared land. Everything in this bustling place appeared to be in motion. The very streets seemed to be starting up of their own accord, ready-made and looking as fresh and new as if they had been turned out of the workman's hands but an hour before, or that a great boxful of new houses had been sent by steam from New York and tumbled out on the half-cleared land. I need not say that these half-finished, whole-finished, and embryo streets were crowded with people, carts, stages, cattle, pigs, far beyond the reach of numbers. And as all these were lifting up their voices together, in keeping with the clatter of hammers, the ringing of axes, and the creaking of machinery, there was a fine concert, I assure you. So I think that captures something of what it was like a lot in these cities along the Erie Canal that were just booming with this new industrialization. The War of 1812 had been really devastating for New England as a region, which really depended upon the shipping and fishing industries, both of which had been completely stopped by the war. New England investors were watching their ships just rot in the harbor, and they hit upon a solution. They decided they were going to shift their money, their investing money, their capital, to manufacturing, especially textiles. And the first factory was established in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in 1790 by a man named Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater was a very skilled mechanic. He built from memory a spinning jenny, which was one of the key inventions of the Industrial Revolution. And he produced yarn. It was a spinning factory that produced yarn, and the yarn was then sent out to traditional handloom weavers and farm families to be woven into cloth. This was called the outwork system, and it was very typical of early industrialization. Eventually, what we're going to see is the entire process gets brought under one roof. So the War of 1812 really stimulated the establishment of the first large-scale American factories using power looms for weaving cotton cloth. In 1814, in Waltham, Massachusetts, a group of merchants known as the Boston Manufacturing Company decided they were going to set up this factory. One of these men, Francis Cabot Lowell, had spent a couple of years in Britain. And while he was there, he had toured the textile mills in Manchester. And the technology of the power loom was it was a national secret for the British. They were guarding it very jealously. And when Lowell left Britain, shortly before the War of 1812 broke out, customs officers at the station where he left, they actually searched his luggage twice. They were looking for stolen plans. They thought that Lowell was trying to steal plans for how to build one of these power looms. What they didn't realize was that Lowell had actually memorized the structure of the loom well enough to replicate it once he got back to the United States. Once the mills at Waltham proved to be successful, by the 1820s, the investors expanded their enterprise. They created a whole new factory town, the town of Lowell, named after Francis Cabot Lowell. That was incorporated in 1836. And they built a group of modern textile factories that brought together all phases of production. These early factories tended to be located along waterfalls or river rapids that could be harnessed for providing power for the machinery. By the 1840s, now that you had steam power, that made it possible for factory owners to locate in towns like New Bedford, which were nearer to the coast, and also in large cities like Philadelphia and Chicago. And so this becomes known as the American system of manufactures. In 1850, manufacturers were producing all kinds of goods, tools, firearms, shoes, clocks, ironware, agricultural machinery. So this involved the mass production of interchangeable parts that could be rapidly assembled into standardized finished products. Now, in these early textile mills, they mainly relied upon female labor and also child labor. Farm women had long supplemented the family income by weaving woolen yarn and cloth. That was what Samuel Slater's factory had produced. They produced yarn, which they then sent out to these women living on these farms in the local area, and they would spin the yarn into cloth. Or they would weave the yarn into cloth. Now, cotton from the South, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute, provided the raw material that was a lot more plentiful than the wool that they had previously been using. So now that these women are no longer, sort of producing the cloth in their homes, they were leaving the home. They get recruited by the Lowell Mill Company. And at Lowell, young unmarried women, probably not much older than you or the other, sort of women in your class, dominated the workforce. And they were the ones who were tending these spinning machines. They lived in boarding houses together with very strict rules regarding their behavior. The conditions they were working in were not great. They worked pretty long hours. The conditions were pretty unhealthy. But it was really an opportunity for these young women to get an education. They would go to lectures and go to church in their free time. They would go to learn, sort of all kinds of stuff in these speeches. And it was really the first time in history that large numbers of women, at least in American history, that large numbers of women were leaving their homes to participate in the public world. They're moving outside their families, they are operating independently, they're earning their own money. And it was a time when very few other jobs were open to women. So this was actually a really great opportunity for a lot of women, despite the terrible conditions they were working under. Now, these women were not permanent factory workers. Typically, they only worked for a few years, after which they would go back home. They might get married. They might move out to the West. And so this was a very common cycle for these mill girls, as they were called. Women found in general, though, that the opportunities of the market revolution weren't really all that available to them. The household, because of all these manufacturing happening, the household was starting to decline as the center of economic production. And their women's traditional roles as, being the people producing goods to be sold, things like textiles and stuff like that, were now being undermined because now you started to have mass-produced goods that had previously been made at the home. Some women followed the work, as we've seen, as the work moved from household to factory. Others embraced a kind of new ideas, new definition of femininity, glorifying women's ability to make the home this private environment that would be shielded from all the competition and the cutthroat world of the market economy. And so it was sort of widely believed at this time that the place for women was in the home, that their role was to sustain love, friendship, mutual obligation, to provide men with a shelter place from the competitive marketplace. So the cult of domesticity is kind of a subtle evolution of the earlier ideology of the years of the early republic that was very common, known as Republican motherhood. The earlier idea of Republican motherhood had sort of allowed women kind of a public role as being the mothers of future citizens. So you need to have virtuous, educated citizens for the new republic. Who is going to educate those citizens? It's going to be mothers. And so this idea of Republican motherhood was very common back in the early part of the 19th century. But now this is starting to shift more towards this idea of the cult of domesticity. Now women were required to exhibit, as one popular magazine of the era put it, a spirit of obedience and submission, pliability of temper, and humility of mind. So we've got more and more men leaving the home, going out to work. We've got women sort of exercising power over the personal affairs within the family home, but we have a real minimization of women's participation in the outside world. Men, of course, could go back and forth. Men could move freely between the public sphere of the marketplace, where you're going out to work and you are going out to vote and you're going out to, socialize with other men, and the private sphere, which was the family and the home. Women were supposed to remain within the private sphere of the family. Now, of course, these prevailing gender norms didn't really have much to do with the real experiences of women who worked for wages, and many did work for wages during this era despite severe disadvantages. Women tended to work as very low paying jobs if they were working at all. Married women, as we have talked about in class, married women were not seen as independent. They could not sign contracts, they could not sue in their own names, they could not control their own wages. But for poor people living in cities and also for farm families living on the frontier, the labor of all family members was really essential to economic survival. So thousands of poor women found work as domestic servants, as factory workers, as seamstresses. And a lot of the work being done in these middle class homes was done by these domestic servants. It was the largest category of employment for women in the 19th century, in early 19th century America. The freedom of these middle class women, defined in part as freedom from having to do this sort of household drudgery, that really depended on the employment of other women within the household. So poorer women who would work as domestic servants. And so, in the market economy, where labor increasingly meant work that created monetary value, labor becomes equated with men. And so, the idea that the male head of household should earn a wage to support his family was very popular and influential at the time. So, what are we seeing the development of this northern market society? In the north, the region really transforms into an integrated economy of commercial farms and manufacturing cities. Everything is sort of bound together by this web of transportation and credit, and it's all sort of dependent upon cities in the east, which become these centers of commerce and banking. Farmers find themselves drawn into this new market economy. People are increasingly concentrating on growing crops and livestock for sale, and they are purchasing goods that were previously made at home. People are taking out loans to finance buying up new land and supplies. And by the 1840s and 1850s, fertilizer, new agricultural machinery to expand production. In 1837, John Deere invents the steel plow, which is starting to be mass produced by the 1850s. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick invents the reaper, which were these horse-drawn machines, greatly increasing the amount of wheat that a farmer could harvest. So we've got all of these, sort of new machines, new devices, making it possible to grow more food, harvest more efficiently. And we're starting to see new cities springing up as well. Cities on the western frontier in Ohio and Illinois, Cincinnati. Became a sort of booming city during this period. It became a center for slaughterhouses. It was nicknamed Porkopolis because there were so many slaughterhouses there. Chicago, by 1860, is now, thanks to the railroad, becoming the nation's fourth largest city. And this is where farm products all throughout the Northwest are being gathered to be sent eastward. Merchants, bankers, master craftsmen in the cities, they are all taking advantage of the economic opportunities that have been created by this expanding market. And it's also fundamentally altering the nature of work itself. Traditionally, you had very skilled artisans manufacturing goods at home, goods like shoes and wooden furniture and clocks and all these kinds of things that could be manufactured by a skilled artisan either in their home or maybe in a shop that was near their home, and they were able to control the pace and the intensity of their own labor. Now we're starting to see mass production, so artisans being gathered into these large workshops, and this becomes a process known as de-skilling, where You start to see mass production involves, kind of the labor process being broken down into numerous steps. And once you're no longer, an artisan making a shoe, but you are just, sort of pounding a few nails into the heel of a shoe and then sending it along to your neighbor who's going to finish the shoe. That is, that's a process where your skills are gradually kind of, being taken away. Less skill, less training is required to actually produce the good that you could produce at home before. So all of this economic expansion really fueled a demand for labor, and some of this was met in part by increased immigration. Between 1820 and 1860, over 5 million people entered the United States. The majority were coming from Ireland and from Germany. About 90% of these immigrants went to states in the North. There was a lot more job opportunities in the North, and also they weren't having to compete with enslaved labor. There are a number of push factors that lead people to leave their homes in Europe and come to the United States. In Europe, you've got the modernization of agriculture, and the Industrial Revolution is taking hold, and it's disrupting all the old patterns of life. And it's pushing the peasants off the land, and it's eliminating the jobs of traditional craft workers. You've also got political upheaval. In 1848, there were a number of failed revolutions in Europe. So you've got political refugees who are fleeing repressive governments and rigid social hierarchies. The largest number of immigrants, though, are refugees from disaster. These are the Irish people fleeing the Great Famine between 1845 to 1851, when a blight destroyed the potato crop there. 1 million Irish people starved to death in the famine. Another million emigrated, and mainly they came to the United States. And of course, there are also pull factors that are making it more possible to come to the United States, and also drawing people to come here. America's political freedom and religious freedom was very attractive to a lot of Europeans. And also technology. Ocean-going steamships and the railroad made long-distance travel much more possible now. So immigrants are flooding into the country. They don't have a lot of industrial skills. They don't have a lot of money. And they are really taking the low wage, unskilled jobs that native born Americans didn't want to do. Male Irish immigrants built America's railroads. They dug America's canals. They worked as laborers, as longshoremen, as factory workers. Irish women became servants in the homes of native-born Americans. Some preferred to work in the factories, and actually by the end of the 1850s, the Lowell textile mills replaced New England farm women as workers with Irish immigrant families. So now you have immigrants working in the textile mills. Uh, Irish immigrants were coming from a very impoverished country, and so they had a lot more difficulty adjusting to American life than did immigrants coming from Great Britain or from Germany. But nevertheless, they rose to the occasion. They worked really, really hard, and they began to be able to earn enough to prosper in the United States. And they were able to send back money to their family members who they had left behind in the old country, often enabling them to come and reunite their family in America. This is a pattern known as chain migration. German immigrants tended to be more skilled than the Irish were. Some settled in eastern cities. A lot of them, though, moved out to the west, or what was then considered to be the west. And they they began to gravitate towards cities like Cincinnati and St. Louis and Milwaukee. You also have Scandinavians coming to the United States in the early part of the 19th century, about 40,000 Scandinavians coming, most of them settling on farms in the old Northwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, for example. American history has witnessed periodic eras of very intense anxiety over immigration. And the early 19th century saw this phenomenon as well. A lot of this was fueled by anti-Catholicism. Some Protestants found it very troubling that there were all of these, sort of Irish immigrants who happened to be Catholic, also German immigrants, many of them also happened to be Catholic as well, coming to the United States. And in 1831, a prominent Presbyterian minister named Lyman Beecher delivered a sermon in Boston in which he called it a plea for the West. And he argued that Catholics were coming in and they were trying to dominate, the country. And this actually inspired an angry mob to go and burn down a Catholic convent in Boston. And there were violent anti-immigrant riots in other cities around the country as well, in New York City, in Philadelphia. So there's this real wave of nativism coming in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Immigrants get blamed for crime. They get blamed in the 1840s and 50s for political corruption, for alcoholism. As you can see in this cartoon here, it's kind of, arguing several of those points. You've got an immigrant labeled Irish whiskey and lager beer, that would be German, and they seem to be making off with the ballot box here. So there's arguments that they are voting illegally. Where have we heard that before? Arguments that they are bringing crime into the country, that they're alcoholics. They are, of course, it's a lot of this is economic. They are always, we see the same arguments being made about they're taking jobs at very low wages. They're undercutting the, native-born workers. And they are, kind of very stereotyped. Immigrants tended to, be labeled with these very, kind of negative stereotypes. Nativism, this hostility to immigrants, especially Catholics, it actually becomes a national political movement in the 1850s with the appearance of what was called the American Party, sometimes nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. They were called the Know Nothings because it began as a secret organization whose members, when asked about its existence, were supposed to respond, "I know nothing." And their big issue was we want political office to be reserved to native-born Americans. They were also very anti-Catholic. In 1854, they swept the state elections in Massachusetts. They elected the governor, all of the congressmen, nearly every member of the state legislature was part of this Know Nothing Party. And their appeal combined this anti-Catholicism, also anti-alcoholism, and also anti-slavery, oddly enough. So it was this very weird mix of political beliefs. They don't end up, being very successful as a political party, however. So a lot of Americans experience the market revolution as a real sort of, tenuous time, a period in which they were, sort of losing a lot of their economic freedom. This period between the War of 1812 and 1840, as we're going to see, we see some really volatile economic swings, and it's a real up and down economy. And it means that the gap between the very, very wealthy and the working classes is growing bigger. In Massachusetts, the nation's most industrialized state at the time, the richest 5% of residents of Massachusetts owned more than half of the wealth. And workers are really worried about this. They are alarmed at their skills going away, the erosion of their traditional skills. There's threat of being reduced to just this dependent wage earner. Skills craftsmen in the late 1820s created the first working men's parties. These are sort of political organizations mobilizing lower class support for candidates who supported things like free public education, an end to debtors' prisons, legislation limiting work to 10 hours per day. So we're starting to see kind of the early labor movement developing here. Working class people are beginning to organize in the 1820s and 1830s. And we start to see union organization spread and strikes become commonplace. The early labor movement also called for opening up new areas to work in the West, new areas for land in the West. And they, sort of argued that the government should be promoting Western settlement because this was sort of the dream, right, for these laborers to earn enough money to then be able to go out West and settle on their own land. The language that they used to protest working conditions and to protest their, sort of low wages really drew upon older ideas of freedom being linked to economic autonomy and social equality. In 1835, a group of tailors in New York were convicted for union activity, and they inspired this public protest marking what they called the burial of liberty. In 1834, the Lowell Mill girls walked off their jobs when their employers raised the rents at the boarding houses where they had to stay. And they were carrying, as they went on strike, they were carrying banners affirming their rights as daughters of free men. And they argued the oppressive hand of avarice would enslave us. So they are really using this language of freedom to protest their economic conditions and their working conditions. So the social upheavals of the market revolution created these new tensions between the rich and the poor, particularly between the new class of workers and the new class of managers. And we see Lowell, Massachusetts becoming really the center of this. It's the location, of course, the first real American factory. And this is a historical document about a woman. She is Harriet Hanson Robinson. She's writing her memoirs about what she remembers being one of these mill girls and going out on strike. Her mother actually sort of ran a boarding house there. And she was, as a girl, she went to work in the factory. And when she was 11 years old, the mill owners raised the boarding charges for the mill girls, which basically meant that they got a 12.5% pay cut. So the mill girls decided to go on strike or turn out, as they called it. So she describes what happened when this happened. She said, "I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient and started on ahead, saying with childish bravado," and remember, she's 11 at the time, "I don't care what you do. I'm going to turn out whether anyone else does or not." And I marched out and was followed by the others. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been since at any success I may have achieved, and more proud than I shall ever be again until my own beloved state gives to its women citizens the right of suffrage. It is hardly necessary to say that so far as results were concerned, this strike did no good. The dissatisfaction of the operatives subsided or burned itself out, and though the authorities did not accede to their demands, the majority returned to their work and the corporation went on cutting down the wages. So the strike ended up failing. Harriet's mother actually lost her job in retaliation for her daughter's action. But she was writing this, sort of years later, and she described how this was really the proudest moment of her life. She continued to work in the mills. She actually, rose up and became an actual sort of mill operative herself. She fought to attend high school for 2 years, and then she worked again, went back and worked in the mills. She wrote stories and poetry for a magazine that the mill girls put together called The Offering, which is the first magazine in the world written exclusively by women. And eventually she ended up joining the women's suffrage movement. So she ended up actually passing away in 1911. So she didn't live long enough to see women win the right to vote nationally. But you can see, sort of her pride at being part of this, sort of action that these mill girls were taking. Between 1790 and 1840, about 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains and went to settle in what was known as the kind of West at the time. Most of this migration happened after the War of 1812. It unleashed a full flood of land hungry settlers. From 1815 to 1821, six new states entered the Union: Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Alabama, Mississippi, and Maine. Uh, People basically traveled together and they cooperated with each other to clear land in these regions, to build houses and barns, to establish communities. Uh, and there were kind of two streams of this settlement. One stream, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in just a minute, uh, created what was then called the new Cotton Kingdom in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. After the war, thousands of people rushed into what was then considered to be the Southwest. Between 1810 and 1820, Alabama's population increased to 128,000. Mississippi's doubled to 75,000. The population of Louisiana also doubled to 153,000. One planter in North Carolina lamented that the Alabama farm families, the Alabama fever rages here with great violence and has carried off vast numbers of our citizens. So you've got people moving to the Southwest. You also have farm families from the Upper South moving into what was Southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And then you have a third group from New England moving into the upper Northwest, Northern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. Some people move out there and they basically just set up their own farms on unoccupied land. They don't own this land, they don't have legal title to it. Those who bought land in this region of the Trans-Appalachian West bought it either from the government or they bought it from land speculators on credit. And this becomes the home of these regional cultures, very similar to those that the migrants had left behind. They sort of brought their culture with them. So the upper Northwest really resembled New England. There were small towns, churches, schools. The lower South resembled the plantation-based society of South Carolina and Georgia. The Ohio River became an important boundary here. It was really the boundary between free states and slave states, but there was a lot of travel and commerce between across this natural border. Kentucky, of course, is a state with slavery, and then Illinois, Indiana, Ohio are considered to be free states. But it's a region where it's very similar culturally to the upper South, states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. And this large concentration of people who had Southern ancestry made this region a really key battleground as the controversy over slavery develops. Americans also are traveling beyond the nation's actual boundaries to settle in places like Florida, which at the time is still sort of controlled by the Spanish. Texas, also controlled by the Spanish, and then Mexico. Oregon, which at the time was a disputed territory. The United States had a claim, Britain had a claim, Russia had a claim to the Oregon Territory. Basically, the Americans are moving to these regions kind of under the idea that, eventually America is going to, kind of get control over these areas. In 1840, the government had sold to settlers and land companies nearly 43 million acres of land. And about 7 million Americans, about 2/5 of the total population of the whole country, is living in this region beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So it's a really booming region of the country. I'm going to talk in more detail now about a particular region, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. So this is made possible mainly because of the Industrial Revolution. The introduction of steam power in British industry meant that the cost of making yarn and fabric, textiles, was very much lowered, which led to they needed more demand for the actual raw material that you use to make this cloth, which meant cotton. And we see this happening both in England, but also in the Northeast in the United States. Prompted by all this new demand, we start to see enslavers increasing the cultivation of cotton along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. Now, there are two varieties of cotton. There is the long staple form and the short staple form. The long staple form of cotton does not grow very well inland. The short staple form of cotton really just could not be cultivated for many years because of the time and the expense that was needed to separate the seeds from the fiber. But it's an invention again, the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793 that made possible the emergence of the Cotton South. And it's impossible to overemphasize the importance of cotton to the Southern economy and to the whole country's economy, the whole American economy. Annual cotton production rose from, in 1790, there were about 3,000 bales being grown, to, by 1810, that number had gone up to 178,000 bales. And prior to the Civil War, America is producing more than 4 million bales of cotton every year. 3/4 of this is exported to Britain. It's the United States' leading export. And it's the base for the growth of the factory system in New England. It plays this huge role in the industrialization of the North. So it's not as though the Southern economy is just separate from what's going on in the North. They are very intimately tied together. And what we see is that it creates this insatiable demand for enslaved labor. In some ways, economic growth in the South followed very traditional American patterns. Enslavers pushed further westward. They speculated in land. They carved farms out of the wilderness. They shipped their agricultural products to markets in the East, and they enjoyed the profits. But economic growth in the South was based largely on just these sort of few staple crops, cotton primarily, but also sort of crops like tobacco and indigo and rice. So it's a very limited number of crops. It is not a very diversified economy. So southern states produced more by putting more land into cultivation, not by developing new technologies or by diversifying their economy. The rise of the Cotton Kingdom really brought about a momentous transformation. Cotton became this driving force in expanding and transforming the economy, not just of the South, but of the entire United States. While the growing of cotton really comes to dominate the economic life of the lower South, the manufacture of cotton textiles is fueling the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. Most of America's exported cotton is going to Britain. By giving the United States its leading export, the enslaved workers in the cotton fields are enabling the United States to buy manufactured goods from Europe, to pay the interest on its foreign debt, to continue to import more capital to invest in transportation and industry. So a lot of all of this market revolution and the industrialization of the country is really built upon the back of the enslaved field hand in the cotton fields. And what we see here developing for enslaved people is really what is sometimes being called a second Middle Passage. Enslavers in non-cotton producing states are now be able to profit from their enslaved people by shipping them south and west to go work in cotton producing states. This involved breaking up families. It forced enslaved people to relocate far from everyone and everything they had known. So even though the international slave trade has been halted by this time, the long-distance domestic slave trade is increasing. It's hard to know precise numbers, but approximately 1 million enslaved people, twice as many as had crossed the Atlantic from Africa to America, to what would then become the United States, moved west between 1790 and 1860. Sometimes they moved with their enslavers who were leaving their homes to set up, looking for more lucrative opportunities to set up their, farms in a new location, and they took their enslaved people with them. Others get sold away from their original enslavers. The most recent book on the domestic slave trade during the early part of the 19th century estimates that 60 to 70% of enslaved people who were relocated were sold. So it's a sort of large majority were actually sold from states in the east and then sold west. Professional slave trading became a very lucrative business. It was lucrative, but it was never considered to be entirely respectable. Being a slave trader was really not considered to be a respectable profession. And this gives you some indication of how, sort of people were thinking about the sort of institution of slavery at the time. If it was not considered to be respectable to be a person who trafficked in human beings, then what does that say about how people were thinking about slavery in general? So there's this widespread discomfort with the slave trade, and it really highlights this troubling contradiction in people who are trying to advocate for the institution of slavery to be maintained. If buying and selling human beings is wrong, it's hard to avoid questioning the legitimacy of owning them, right? It's traumatic for the enslaved people either way. Slave narratives from the time are full of heartbreaking stories about being sold away from your family, or having your child or your wife or your husband sold off. And this phrase, sold down the river, is a very prevalent fear and a threat used by enslavers to keep enslaved people in line. So, on the whole, we've seen sort of some of the benefits, but also some of the drawbacks of the market revolution. And we've seen that there are winners and there are losers. So, who are the winners and losers in the market revolution? Winners, obviously, the quote unquote self made man, this sort of idea of an individual, an independent individual, coming up with an idea and pulling himself up by his bootstraps and, being, kind of a self-made individual. That's something that really stems from this period of the market revolution. Bankers, merchants, industrialists, planters, they are all big winners in the market revolution. Professional men, also huge winners. Lawyers, doctors, educated men. And really, the new middle class is a big winner in the market revolution. Who are the losers? Well, enslaved people, the extension and the further institutionalization of slavery with the rise of cotton really leads to enslaved people being kind of the big losers in the market revolution. Free Black Americans who are largely excluded from the new economic opportunities of the era. Women whose, in some ways, their status gets exalted, but it also gets confined. So women are being put up on a pedestal as being these pure, beautiful sort of women who are, making the home a refuge and a safe place for their husbands, but they are confined to that domestic sphere to a large extent. And really the working class. We have this process of de-skilling. We have all the economic volatility of the period. We have this sort of growing idea of dependency, being dependent upon wages for your livelihood. And so we really see that there are winners and there are losers in this market revolution. All right, so this week we are going to be looking at a little bit more about this market revolution. And so before class on October 30th, you should make sure to read Chapter 8 in the American Yawp. Make sure that you complete the reading quiz as well. And you want to make sure to read Chapter 8 in your Going to the Source text. That's what we're going to be focusing in on for Wednesday. All right, I will see everybody then. Take care, everybody.